Welcome to episode 6 of Layer by Layer, my Photoshop post-processing tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to be breaking down this seascape that you see in front of you, shot at Pfeiffer Beach in California. In this video, we're going to be covering two specific techniques, blending through water and color matching a foreground with a sky drop. So let's get started. So I'll first show you the source frames that I used to construct this final shot. I used 3 frames. The first frame here is just for the foreground water motion. So when I shot this frame, all I really cared about was getting a nice anchoring foreground element and some water motion here in the foreground to lead into a midground and background frame that I knew I was going to blend in later in the field. Next, for the midground frame, here closer to sunset, this was shot in December when the setting sun will appear right in the keyhole of this sea stack here. This is the event that I came out here to specifically shoot. This frame, when I was shooting, I knew that all I really cared about was getting this sea stack and this sun star exactly right. To make the blend easy, I wanted to keep some of this midground water and the rocks on the beach. But at this point, I already had the water motion frame that I knew I was going to use. And so I didn't really care about what was going on this part of the frame. And finally, a little later in the night, after the sun had already set, turned my camera a little more to the north and caught this nice burning sky. So all 3 of these frames went into this final shot. And you can kind of see, right, this is the foreground frame here, blended into the midground frame, and then the background sky over here. So now let's hop into Photoshop and I'll break down the initial blend. Okay, so now we're in Photoshop. I've got the midground layer activated only. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to try and blend in that frame for the foreground water. With the mask disabled, this is what that foreground frame is going to look like. So as you can see, I've really warped the hell out of it. This is just because I wanted to really fill the bottom of the frame with this rock here. And I knew I wasn't going to use basically anything beyond the line of the surf here. And so, for me, I didn't really care how I warped it as long as the foreground here looked good. So what I was specifically looking for when I was lining up this foreground frame and warping it around was, so if I lower the opacity here, I wanted this line of the surf, if you can just barely see it with the opacity lowered, to kind of line up with the line of the surf in the midground frame, which is right here. And so I'll just toggle that once or twice for you, like that. This isn't strictly necessary. Blending through water is pretty easy, and you can be pretty lazy with it. This just made it a little bit easier for me and helped me kind of like line up this leading line the way that I want it to. As far as the mask goes, blending through water is surprisingly easy as long as you can match up points in the water where both your background frame and your foreground frame have water moving in roughly the same direction. And so I'll first show you this mask just by itself. This is an entirely hand-painted mask, and as you can see, it's not the cleanest mask. But the good thing is for water motion, this doesn't really matter. Water looks pretty much like any other water. And so it's pretty easy to find areas where you can kind of fudge the blend line and get a little lazy. Now, if I show you this frame with the foreground mask enabled, here's what we're left with. So I'll zoom in on the blend line here. And I'll toggle the frame on and off, and you guys can kind of see how I decided to go with the blend. So on this left side here, I blended the foreground water motion all the way up until these rocks in the midground. These were kind of like a really nice anchoring point for me to draw the blend line. And as you can see, if I zoom in real close on some of these rocks, the foreground water kind of bleeds into it, right? But unless you got someone who's printing this at like 5 feet and standing inches away from it, just staring at these individual rocks, no one's really going to notice, right? This blend light honestly doesn't even look that unnatural, right? Like you can kind of imagine that the kind of blurry areas here where the foreground water bleeds into the rock are from water motion created when a wave was coming in or out. So on the left side here, if I toggle this foreground frame on and off, you can see kind of exactly how I blended this water motion in. And the nice thing about matching up that surf line with the warp that we did when we first placed in this foreground frame is that the motion of this foreground water kind of nicely matches the motion of this midground water. So you don't have something awkward where you got this really violent water motion in the foreground and then a patch of real calm water here, and then further in the background, more violent water. And so moving across the frame a little bit, again, just use these rocks as a rough blend line. Turn this on and off. See, so I blended right here below this rock and kind of followed the natural curve of this little wave here from the foreground frame. And I just so happened to work out nicely that this wave here kind of matched up with the line of the water from the midground frame all the way back here. When you're blending through water, you'll find a lot of happy little coincidences like this. It is, in my opinion, one of the easiest blends to do, dropping a water motion frame into the foreground of another seascape. And I'm moving a little further across the frame. Again, kind of following the natural line of the water from the midground and the foreground and using the rocks as an anchoring point for the blend line here. So as you can see, I kind of followed the line created by the water right here in the midground frame and just real kind of softly blended in this wave from the foreground frame. You know, when you're at 600% here, sure, it doesn't look super natural, but once we zoom out and we apply all our other effects and corrections, no one's really going to notice this. They're just going to see the final product and think that it looks nice. And the rest of the frame is pretty much the same story. The only tricky part is this center part of the water here. So you see we got this nice light on the water from the sun shining through the keyhole, right? The foreground frame doesn't have that light in any of its water. So I had to be real careful to preserve this part of the midground. So in this part of the frame, my blend line shifted down a lot. So in the end, I did have to cut off a little bit of this light, but with a softer blend line, it doesn't look too unnatural. It's still showing through a little bit. And for the rest of the frame, it's kind of the same story. Just trying to avoid blending through the areas where there was light and using rocks as an anchoring point. And of course, as before, just trying to follow the natural lines of the water. And this wasn't a scenario where I had shot like 100 water motion frames and I went through each of them one by one in Photoshop trying to find one that lined up correctly, right? I shot maybe 5 frames, picked the one that looked the nicest and just dropped it into Photoshop, warped it around a bit, and blended it in. This is actually the way that I prefer to work when I'm shooting a seascape. I like to show up a little early on location, grab some good frames for water motion, get a little wet, and then back up and just focus on my composition and the light when I'm shooting the actual sunset event. If you're shooting sunrise, it's even more convenient because you can shoot your sunrise event and then get wet and just go straight back to your car. However you choose to do it, just remember, don't wait too long between your water motion frames and your midground and background frames. The longer you wait, the tougher it's going to be to match the lighting and the color. Usually, I end up shooting my water motion frames maybe 15-20 minutes before my midground and background frames, for example. Okay, so now that we've got the foreground blended into the midground, we'll just even it out real quick with an exposure adjustment because it's just a little bit bright for that midground. And then we'll drop the sky in, and that's going to look something like this. So I'll show you guys the mask by itself first. This specific mask, I'm pretty sure I hand painted this from edge to edge, which was pretty annoying, but not that awful, surprisingly. If you don't feel like doing that, this should be totally doable with a Z-curve and a luminosity mask, just like all the nightscape composites that we did in episodes 1 through 3. You'll just have to be a little careful here on the right edge, where in the original frame here, the ocean meets the sky. So most of the time when I'm dropping a sky, I like to try to use a little bit of the original sky at a low opacity at the horizon. So normally I would take a real low opacity black brush after painting in this white part of the mask and just kind of blend in a little bit of that original sky. In this case, I didn't do it, but it does help make blends a little more realistic if you don't have such a sharp transition from sky to water. In this case, that actually wasn't that necessary because the sky frame here, I kind of lined up the horizons, right? And so you don't have this like super, super vibrant cloud color extending all the way down to the horizon. Because in real life, closer to the horizon, you're looking through a lot more atmosphere. And so you shouldn't see quite as much color and things shouldn't be quite as vibrant and clear. But in this case, because the horizons line up kind of nicely, it all works out in the end with a harsher blend line. Okay, so now with the sky dropped in here, this looks super, super fake, right? And one of the primary reasons why this looks so bad is because in real life, with a really vibrant sunset like this, you'd have that color reflected in all of your foreground surfaces, right? Especially like the highlights in the water, the rocks here, the sands, even the sea stack a little bit. So we're going to use a nifty little trick to kind of artificially match the color between our foreground and the background. So first thing, this foreground's pretty bright for this sky file here, right? This is a sky file from after the sun had already set. This foreground shouldn't be nearly this bright. So we'll just apply a curves layer here and tone it down. Now the color problems are even more evident, right? Like this foreground is super, super blue, and we have all these awesome pinks and oranges in the sky here that need to make their way down here. So I'll show you guys my trick for evening out color now. What you're gonna do is you're gonna take your sky file here and you're just gonna duplicate it as is. Go ahead and delete that layer mask and then go to Edit, Transform, and flip it along the vertical. So now you can kind of imagine that we're taking the sky and we're reflecting it onto the foreground water. Lower your opacity just enough so you can see where you're putting this. I like to line up the horizons just about, so something like that. And then with the horizons lined up, I'm first going to rasterize this real quick just because my computer can't quite handle this. And then free transform and drag it out just so the colorful part of the sky will cover all of the foreground. I'm having some technical difficulties here because, as you can see here in my copy of Photoshop CC 2019, this little lock aspect ratio thing really doesn't do anything. So I can't drag this guy and transform it in vertical only. Thanks Adobe, I suppose, for the amazing software. Maybe we can get around this. Just type in, yeah, okay, so we'll just type it in, right? Anyways, this is still pretty garbage. Anyways, hopefully they've already released a patch and I'm just behind. This is a pretty egregious issue here with free transform. But anyways, we'll just do this for now, and you kind of get the point. Okay, technical difficulties aside, we have this thing free transform more or less like it should be. I'm actually gonna go ahead and tweak that just a little bit more. Line up the horizons once again. Let's go to 220% on the height. Get the horizons lined up, and yeah, that's pretty good. So what you're looking for here is for this colorful part to just extend all the way to the bottom of the frame, more or less. Cool, so we'll apply this now. Turn that opacity now back up to 100%. Go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and you're gonna really blur the crap out of this frame. And so for something like this, this was shot on a 24 megapixel sensor. I'm gonna blur it like 300 pixels. So what you're looking for here is for all the detail in the frame to just completely go away. You want just a blob of color that's only vaguely reminiscent of the original sky. And for this, 300 seems okay. 200 might also be decent, actually. So we'll go with that. Okay, now with our sky blurred to oblivion, I'm going to take this blend mode here and change it to soft light. Now you can immediately see that the foreground looks a lot better. The sky looks like crap, right? And that's because we need to mask this color match only into the foreground. And good thing for us, we already have a mask that does exactly that, and that's our original sky mask. You're going to select that, invert it, and apply it. Now, from here, you can just tweak the opacity so you get an effect that's more appropriate. And then from here, you can just paint on this mask in areas where the effect might be too strong or too weak. So I'll show you my original frame that I used for the color match. Let's delete this guy. And that looks like this. So the opacity is pretty low at 35%. And I'll show you guys without the mask here what this layer looks like at 100% opacity. And then with the mask on. So in this instance, I actually let this effect bleed into the sky a little bit, right? And so I'll turn on just the sky frame. So it's been about 2 years since I processed this frame, but I believe my thinking at the time was that the colors here in the sky were a little weak, and with this color match layer applied like this with a little bit bleeding into the sky, it just made the overall composition that much stronger. And so let's turn the rest of our layers back on. Cool. And then back down to 35% opacity as it originally was. So you don't have to go super ham with this, just enough so that the color differences aren't so drastic anymore. This step is going to be maybe one of the most important steps for making a sky drop look realistic. So spend some time with this, transforming your sky file in different ways, choosing different Gaussian blur radiuses, and changing how you blend this color match layer into your foreground. So with that out of the way, we will darken the foreground once more, just because, in this frame here, the only light that's coming through is this backlighting from the sun, or that's the way it should be, right? And so this foreground really shouldn't be quite this bright. Next up, we're going to tweak the color match even a little more. We're going to create a dodge burn layer. So you're going to create a new soft light layer filled with 50% gray. This is just like any other dodge burn layer that we created in every single one of the last episodes. And what you're going to want to do is take your eyedropper tool and pick a color that represents most of the sky that you've dropped in. And so, something like this, something like this. Then in your color picker, take that color and drag it towards this like upper left-hand part of the color range, right? So you want something not the original, but like a brighter, slightly less saturated version of it. Then on your dodge burn layer, take a soft brush. I like to start somewhere around 15 to 20% opacity and brush in this essentially fake sunset color into the highlight areas of your frame that really need it. So I'll toggle this frame on and off for you guys first, just to show you where I painted. So in this case, it was the highlights here in this rock and some of the highlights here, and then matching the color a little bit here at the horizon. And with only this layer showing, you can see exactly where I've painted and kind of the hue that I went with in the end. To sell the blend a little more, I also just burned a little bit of this horizon line here. And that's just, soft, low opacity brush, complete black, just burning it until the blend line looks a little more realistic and convincing. And so if you just focus on this part of the image, burning that water here and letting that drift a little bit into the sky just makes it a little more realistic. Okay, so at this point, we are done with our initial blend. So from here, it's a standard workflow. We're going to apply contrast with luminosity curves. You're going to do some dodging and burning. With the dodging, we're going to accentuate the leading lines here in the foreground for a water motion. Going to burn in a vignette, and then just enhance some of the micro contrast here. Next up, we're going to add some light bleed. So this should be a very familiar process for you. Exact same process as we've done with light bleed in all of the previous episodes. It's a circular gradient and duplicating the layer and decreasing the radius of the circular gradient. So I'll turn some of these layers on for you guys. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if I turn off the mask here on the group, you can see the circular gradient effect. Next, I just wanted to paint in some extra rays from the sun here onto this midgrounds of the water. And that was done just with a manual brush. If I crank this layer up to 100% opacity, you can see. So that's what I've done here. Just manually painted in this kind of triangle, mimicking the spread of a natural sunbeam through the keyhole. And finally, we're going to mask this light bleed only to the areas where we want it to show up. So I'm going to apply this mask, basically just choke this down. Now, in real life, this light bleed wouldn't carry over to so much of this midground sea stack here, right? Because this is a backlit scene, doesn't really make sense for this much light to be on the front of the sea stack. So with this mask here, we'll just choke down the light and focus it on just the very center of the keyhole and shape it in this triangular way. You can also see that I've masked out the backsides of a lot of these midground rocks. And that's just because, again, it's a backlit scene. We shouldn't be bleeding that much light onto the backsides of or rather the front side of all these rocks here. So altogether, the light bleed toggled on and off will look something like this. And this just kind of sells the whole keyhole situation a little bit more. Okay, so at this point, now we're just ready to move on to the final touches. And so I'll hide all that. And we'll turn on this group here, final adjustments. So we're going to desaturate some of the blues here, here, and up here. And that's just because with the vignette burned in, we dramatically increased the saturation, a lot of the blues through here. And for me, it was just a little too much, a little overpowering the color palette. Next, we're just going to stamp this whole thing as is and warp it around a little bit so that we fill the top of the frame with these colorful clouds a little bit more. And so that warp is going to look like this. Straighten out the horizon while I was at it and just stretch the sky and the sea stack a little bit so that we don't have so much blue sky here at the top. Going to vignette it a little bit more once again because of that final warp. We lost some of the original vignetting at the top. And then add a little orton glow for the lit up areas of the rock. And in this case, just a little bit of output sharpening. And that's that. So that's the start to finish for this shot. Today, we really dive deep into two specific techniques that are unique to this shot compared to the previous episodes. And that's blending through water and color matching a foreground. Next episode, I'm going to be covering a very similar seascape, yet again with water motion blended in and a sky drop, but that one's going to be a blue hour shot. It's going to be a little different. So see you guys in 2 or 3 weeks with that episode.